Welcome back for another aviation deep dive.
Yeah.
We've got a pretty interesting mix of stories today. Kind of shows you how airlines are constantly adapting and, strategizing in this crazy industry.
Hmm.
And we've got a small airline making a big move, a major U.S. carrier sort of rethinking their fleet, and even an airline dealing with the fallout from international sanctions. Plus, we'll look at how one airline in the Philippines is using some clever financing to navigate a tough economy.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to see how these trends are playing out, at different scales too. Like you've got a smaller airline, BermudAir, making a pretty bold move. Then you have United, a real major player, kind of reevaluating their whole approach. It really highlights just how dynamic the aviation landscape is right now.
For sure. Let's start with that Bermuda Air story. They're planning to add Embraer E190s to their fleet by the middle of 2025.
Yeah.
Now, Bermuda is a relatively small airline, so this is a pretty ambitious move for them, wouldn't you say?
Oh, definitely. The Embraer E190, it's a regional jet, usually used for routes, maybe 2 to 4 hours long. It's a real workhorse known for being fuel efficient, and, passengers tend to like them, which is really important in today's market. So by adding these planes, BermudAir is clearly signaling that they want to expand, maybe going after new markets or really beefing up service on their current routes. It really makes you wonder what their end game is. Are they trying to dominate a certain region or even, challenge the bigger airlines?
Well, it's worth pointing out that they actually raised capital twice last year, which tells me they've got the financial backing to make these plans happen. They're not just dipping their toes in the water here. They're going all in.
That's a great point. Having that financial support is absolutely crucial for any airline looking to expand, especially in such a competitive market. It'll be really interesting to see how this impacts the competitive landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of navigating a tricky landscape,
Right.
let's talk about United Airlines and their whole back and forth with the Boeing 737 MAX 10. They initially took it off their order book because of the delays, but now they're expressing renewed interest. What's going on there?
Well, the Boeing 737 MX-10 is a really significant aircraft for an airline like United. It's the largest of the 737 MX family. We're talking potential fuel savings of up to 15% compared to older models, plus a significant increase in passenger capacity. And those are huge factors when it comes to, profitability. So for an airline that's focused on cost effectiveness and moving a lot of passengers, the MX 10 is potentially extremely attractive.
Right. But didn't the MAX 10 face some pretty serious delays? Why is United suddenly so optimistic?
You're right, there were some big delays. And it really stemmed from certification issues and regulatory hurdles. After those tragic accidents with the earlier MAX models, regulators worldwide became a lot more cautious about approving any new variant. But Boeing has been working hard to address those concerns and make the necessary improvements, and it seems like that's reassured United.
So while they wait for the 737 MAX 10 to, potentially become a reality, United is relying on other aircraft types like the A321neo. It just goes to show the balancing act that airlines have to pull off when planning their fleets, especially in a market that's so unpredictable.
Oh, absolutely. It's all about anticipating demand managing fuel costs, factoring in those environmental regulations, and of course making sure they have the right planes to get the job done. It's a constant juggling act, and airlines need to be adaptable and really think ahead to stay competitive.
And sometimes things happen that are totally outside of their control. Like look at Wizz Air's situation. They've had to stop refueling in Serbia because of U.S. sanctions. I think a lot of people would be surprised that something happening in Serbia could have such an impact on an airline's operations.
It's a perfect example of how those international sanctions can have this ripple effect, impacting businesses that aren't even directly targeted. The details of these specific sanctions are a little unclear, but it's obvious that they've really disrupted Wizz Air's refueling operations in Serbia, which was probably a key stop on some of their routes.
So what does this actually mean for Wizz Air? What kind of impact are we talking about?
Well, for starters, their costs are going to go up. They'll have to find other places to refuel, which could mean longer flights or even having to reroute completely. It's going to create logistical headaches and throw their schedules off. Definitely not ideal for any airline.
It really makes you think about all the unexpected challenges that airlines might face in this increasingly interconnected world. It makes them vulnerable to all sorts of global events, doesn't it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Airlines aren't operating in a vacuum. They're intertwined with global politics, economics, and even things like international relations. This situation with Wizz Air just underscores that the aviation industry is not immune to these geopolitical realities.
Okay, before we move on, let's wrap up with that story about Cebu Pacific Air in the Philippines. They're pulling off a pretty clever financial move. They recently completed a sale and leaseback deal. Now, for those who aren't familiar with this type of transaction, it basically means they sold an aircraft and then immediately leased it right back. Why would they go through all that?
It all comes down to financial agility, especially in these uncertain economic times. By selling the aircraft and then leasing it back, Cebu Pacific Air frees up a substantial amount of capital, and they can use that money for other things, like buying newer planes, expanding their routes, or even just improving their customer service.
So it's like they get this infusion of cash without actually losing the plane.
Exactly. It's a really smart way for airlines to manage their assets and keep that financial flexibility in such a volatile market. And this brings us back to a central theme we've seen throughout this whole deep dive: the need for airlines to be adaptable and strategic to really thrive. They need to be ready to pivot and adjust their strategies, whether that's because of unforeseen challenges like sanctions or opportunities for growth, like we saw with BermudAir.
That's a great point, and that's a great place to pause for now. We'll be back in just a bit to finish up this deep dive.
Yeah, it really shows you how important it is for airlines to make smart financial decisions, especially when the economy is a bit uncertain.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that Cebu Pacific Air could use that freed up capital to buy newer aircraft, which brings us back to United Airlines and their strategy with the Boeing 737 MX-10. They seem to be hedging their bets a bit by relying on the A321neo while they wait to see what happens with the XX-10.
Yeah, it's a smart move. They're diversifying their fleet, which really helps to reduce the risk, associated with those delayed MAX or 10 deliveries. It gives them more options and helps ensure they can meet their operational needs, no matter what happens with that MAX 10.
So in a way, this is kind of similar to what we were talking about with Wizz. Having a backup plan is super important when you've got all these external factors that can throw a wrench in the works.
Exactly. Airlines need to be nimble and able to adapt quickly, whether it's a geopolitical event like those sanctions and natural disaster, or even just a sudden shift in travel patterns. They need to be able to adjust their operations fast, to minimize disruptions.
Right. So we talked about BermudAir's ambitious expansion, United Airlines, and their whole juggling act with the MAN X-10 and the A321neo and Wizz Air's unexpected challenge with the sanctions. These are all really different situations, but it seems like the common thread is the need for adaptability in the aviation industry.
Oh, absolutely. The ability to adapt is crucial for airlines, not just to survive, but to really thrive in this constantly evolving environment. They need to be constantly evaluating their strategies, assessing risks, and making changes to stay ahead of the curve. It's all about evolution, really.
So for all of you listening out there who are involved in the aviation industry, whether you're pilots, flight attendants, engineers, or executives, what would you say is the key takeaway from all of this?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that the aviation industry is in constant flux. What worked yesterday might not work tomorrow. So staying informed, being flexible, and being prepared to adapt is absolutely essential.
And that's part of what makes this industry so exciting, right? There's never a dull moment. Now let's shift gears back to United Airlines for a second. They're adding 9 new international routes, and 8 of those destinations are currently unserved by any other U.S. carrier. That's a pretty bold move, wouldn't you say?
It certainly is. Expanding into new markets is always a risk, but it also presents a huge opportunity for growth. United is clearly trying to capitalize on new travel demand and, establish themselves in these underserved markets. If they play their cards right, this could be a really strategic move for them.
But it makes you wonder why these destinations haven't been served before. Is it a lack of demand, or logistical difficulties, or something else entirely? What do you think?
That's a good question. There could be a number of factors at play. Maybe these destinations haven't been popular with U.S. travelers in the past, or perhaps there are infrastructure limitations that have made it difficult for airlines to establish routes. It's also possible that United has identified a niche market that they believe they can tap into.
It's almost like they're aviation pioneers venturing into uncharted territory. It'll be fascinating to see how these new routes perform and whether they open up new travel possibilities for passengers.
I agree. It shows their willingness to innovate and expand their reach. It's a reminder that the aviation industry is always evolving, and airlines need to be willing to take calculated risks and explore new horizons if they want to stay competitive.
Okay, so we've talked about BermudAir's bold expansion,
Right.
the United Airlines strategic fleet planning, and they're moving to these new international routes, Wizz Air's unexpected challenge with sanctions, and Cebu Pacific Air's smart financial maneuver. What do you think? Are we missing anything? Is there another key takeaway we should highlight?
I think we've covered a lot of ground and offered some really valuable insights into what's happening in the aviation industry right now. But if I had to add one more takeaway, it would be the importance of collaboration. Airlines can't operate in isolation. They need to work with airports, regulators, and other stakeholders to address challenges, share best practices, and ensure that the global aviation network runs smoothly.
That's a great point. It's easy to focus on the competition in this industry, but at the end of the day, everyone benefits from a safe, efficient, and sustainable aviation system.
Exactly. Collaboration is key to driving innovation, improving safety, and ensuring that the aviation industry remains viable in the long term.
So to sum it all up, what's the one thing you want our listeners to remember from this deep dive?
The aviation industry is constantly evolving, which means there are always new challenges and new opportunities. Airlines that can adapt, innovate, and collaborate are the ones that will thrive in the future.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up part 2 of this episode. We'll be right back to finish our deep dive into these aviation stories. Stay tuned. All right, we're back for the last part of our aviation deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, from fleet strategies and financial moves to those sanctions and the constant need for airlines to adapt. But before we wrap up, I think it's important to remember the human side of all this.
I couldn't agree more. Behind all these headlines about aircraft orders and new routes, you've got the people who keep this massive industry running. The pilots, flight attendants, mechanics, air traffic controllers, baggage handlers, all those folks, they work so hard to make air travel safe and efficient.
It's a global network of people, really dedicated professionals who often don't get the recognition they deserve, but they're absolutely vital.
Absolutely. Without their expertise, their dedication, and their commitment to safety, the whole system would fall apart. It's really a testament to, human ingenuity and our desire to connect with the world.
And that brings us back to the bigger picture of the stories we've been talking about. Whether it's a smaller airline like BermudAir trying to expand, or a giant like United making those complex fleet decisions, or Wizz Air dealing with those unforeseen challenges, it all comes down to connecting people and places.
Yeah, that's the heart of aviation, isn't it? Breaking down barriers, fostering those cultural exchanges, and allowing people to experience the world in ways that just weren't possible before.
It creates so many opportunities. Business, tourism, personal connections, things that really enrich our lives.
And looking ahead, it's exciting to think about the innovations that will continue to shape the industry. Sustainable aviation fuels electric aircraft advancements in air traffic management and the whole passenger experience. There's so much potential for positive change.
We've seen how airlines are stepping up to meet these challenges and taking advantage of new opportunities, so it makes you wonder, what other amazing solutions might we see in the future of air travel? What kind of innovations are coming that will totally change the way we fly?
That's what's so great about this industry. The future of aviation is full of possibilities. I can't wait to see what happens.
Me too. And I'm sure our listeners are just as eager to see what the next chapter of air travel holds. So on that note, we'll wrap up this week's Aviation Deep Dive.
It's been great talking about all this with you.
Thanks for joining us. Until next time, keep your eyes on the skies. And remember, the world is out there waiting to be explored.